Rachel, welcome to This is Horror.
I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. And Bob and I just recently finished reading Black Sheep, which is going to form quite a bit of the conversation, particularly in the second half. Fantastic novel. But before we get into that, I want to know what were some of the early life lessons that you learnt growing up?
Huh. It's a deep question right off the bat. Early life lessons. I I was a very creative, spacey kid. And luckily, my mother was always very encouraging and patient for me and my artistic expression. I was a theater geek when I was little. So rejection, getting rejected, auditioning and being rejected when I was very young, like 7, 8, 9, 10, was a very valuable early lesson. I think being rejected and being told no and having to kind of pick yourself up is a good lesson to have early on and allows you to become a little bit more self aware and, for me, self deprecating. Other early lessons, I think just finding joy through art. And I art has always been like a coping mechanism. If I'm having a tough time with anything, I like to escape into, not deal with the issue, obviously, to kind of escape into other worlds, escape into music, books, movies. So, um, as I've gotten older, I've learned you can't do that all the time. Um, But when I was little, I think anything that felt difficult or rough in my childhood, my mechanism was always escaping into imagination or literature, film, etc.
Yeah, so do you remember the first time that you faced rejection as a child? I wonder as well how you dealt with it in
Ooh.
that moment.
Uh, Dramatically, I'm sure. I'm trying to think like the first time I auditioned for something and didn't get it. Probably in the 5th grade, I auditioned for like the play and there was 7 actor roles and I didn't get an actor role. And I remember being very devastated by that. Um, just having to like learn that, oh, life goes on. Um, but yeah, of course, I probably cried. I still cry when I get rejected. I'm an easy crier. And if I get like angry past a certain point, sad past a certain point, like anytime my emotional level goes above anything other than moderate, I usually start crying. Even though I'm a
Yeah,
34-year-old woman, it's it's kind of embarrassing.
well,
I'm learning now as I'm speaking that maybe I didn't learn enough lessons in my childhood.
yeah, but I think as well it's far healthier, when something builds to let it out in some way. And,
Yes.
you know, I learned as an adult, so almost embarrassing to say as an adult, but that it is for me, I feel it's healthier for it to be let out through sadness and crying rather than through anger. Now, it'd be better for neither, but I think like if it's like kind of sadness and crying, you're far less likely to do damage to other people. It's going to be less destructive in that sense.
Yeah, and I think for me, being able to let emotions out as they come, like to have the catharsis of just being like, I'm upset, I'm gonna have a
Mm,
little cry, and I'm gonna move on with my life is better than times where I've tried to suppress all of my emotion and then it kind of just simmers under the surface. So I'm very pro
yeah.
crying. It's nice to
Yeah.
have a cry.
Yeah, and I think once you cry, you feel a little bit better after having done it. It's like, right,
Yes.
well, we've dealt with that now,
Yeah.
so
I've
now
released
it's
that
gone.
emotion,
Yeah,
blown it into a tissue, and now I can move on.
yeah. Well, I didn't think we were gonna get into crying in under 5 minutes, but sometimes in this as horror,
Well,
that
clearly you've
is
never met me before.
well, that is true. That is very true. And I mean, in terms of your artistic upbringing, I mean, you've mentioned the theater, but I understand too that prior to writing, you would actually tell your mother stories and she would write them down.
Yes,
So
well, I
I
would
want to know. Mm,
instruct her. I would so sh um, I would, like, have stories, and because I couldn't write yet, I'd be like, "Mother, like, please come here." And I would make her write. I would just dictate to her my and, it's like I was obviously very small, so it'd be like nonsense stories. She would patiently sit and dictate. So I'm very lucky that I had a mother who would had the encourage my creativity and also have the patience to put up with me.
and did you find too that people at school, both students and teachers, were equally encouraging?
My fellow classmates probably not as much. They were probably um, sick of me like wanting to play pretend and coming up with like elaborate stories. But my teachers, I had librarian in elementary school named Mrs. Mason, who was very encouraging and would always give me books to read. And then a few of my teachers were very encouraging of my writing ability. I remember in 7th grade we got an assignment to write a mystery story, and I think it was only supposed to be 5 pages, and I turned in like a 25-page epic, and I still got a good grade on it. She wasn't like, "I can't believe I have to grade." I asked for 5 pages, and she handed in a novelette. So, yeah, I think, very lucky growing up that people were patient and encouraging.
Yeah, I remember when I was younger that storytelling and creative writing, it was quite easy because the barriers to entry were low. And I know one exam, I effectively just wrote for the entire exam time an atmospheric Silent Hill ripoff and then got a top mark. And it's like, oh, this writing business is okay. Yeah, fast forward a decade or so, and it's like, oh, damn, this is not, this is not easy at all. But
Still preferable to math, in my opinion.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah, definitely. But do you remember when you first read a story to an audience?
I don't remember reading a story to an audience. I remember doing monologues in my theater class and in theater clubs, but in terms of sharing my own writing, I can't recall. I don't think I read mm, not until I was an adult, I don't think, reading like my own work in front of a crowd.
So, did you ever share the stories with classmates, or was that something you were private about too?
I think I was pretty private about it because I don't think my classmates would have been interested. Like I I had friends who were creative, but not a lot of friends who had the same passion for reading that I did.
Mm,
So, um, I was reading like White Oleander in like 8th grade. My friends were not reading that. Um, and I remember like reading Sylvia Plath in in high school too, and none of my
mm.
friends were like particularly interested in the same things that I was reading, or Shirley Jackson or anything like that. So I didn't really share my own work um, until probably college. And even when I got to college, it was mostly, I was a screenwriting major, so mostly screenplays and things like that.
Yeah, it sounds like in terms of your education, you were always kind of reading one level above. So Sylvia Plath and Jackson, that feels like university, but you were like, well, we're going to start that in high school.
Yes, yes. Reading for, I mean, a lot of teenagers do this, but in my school, in my circle of friends, I was definitely strange and angsty and bookish.
And in terms of your taste, I mean, of course, at the moment, you're most known within the horror genre, I would say. But what about your taste when you were growing up?
I didn't read horror aside from Jackson and then maybe the occasional Stephen King story, and I'm sure others that I can't quite recall. But I didn't read horror until my early 20s because I scare very easily. And when I was growing up, I thought I didn't like horror because I was such a fraidy cat. So it took me a while to realize, like, oh no, I actually love, I love this genre, and it's fine that it freaks me out. When I was younger, I read a lot of like J.D. Salinger, Sylvia Plath. I read all the like books were assigned in school. Um, I read Zora Neale Hurston. I read trying to think what I read that was like off syllabus. Um, I read Jane Austen. I kind of I would go to the library and kind of just pick out a book that looked interesting to me and read it. Um, but when I think back on those times, I think in like the structure of my teen years, I remember a lot of the curriculum, like the Scarlet Letter and um, oh gosh, I had to read the Fountainhead during for AP English one year. But if I'm like thinking back on the snapshots, I think about a lot of the curriculum that I had to read. I don't know. I guess like now that I'm in my 30s, my teen years just seem like a fever dream. I don't know if
Mm.
that's something that just happens where I'm like, I don't remember what I read these books. I don't remember when I read them, or I know I read them, but I don't remember what they were about.
Yeah, and it sounds like a lot of what you were reading, I mean, it was kind of horror tangential, or at least genre tangential. And then, you know, I guess there's an argument, when does Gothic become horror as well? And I tend to find, and I wonder if it was a similar case with you, that some people will feel that they don't like horror, and then their definition of what horror is expands, and they realize, oh, okay, it can be all of these things.
Yeah, I definitely think that when I was younger, I would think about horror mostly in terms of film and then Stephen King books. Um, I like was deeply affected by any horror that I saw. So I remember watching The Blair Witch Project when I was, I think, 12, 11, and being terrified for weeks. And so I wouldn't pick up a horror book because I would think, like, I'm not going to do that to myself. But I think reading horror and watching horror, you feel there's a different feel to it. And we, I think, internalize things differently. I have an easier time reading horror than I do watching horror movies. Like, I read It by Stephen King. That, like, the book itself, and this is going to sound like I'm trying to flex it, but it just didn't scare me. I love the book, but it didn't scare me. The movie, like part one at least, there was parts in that movie that scared me, that were uncomfortable to watch. So I think it's just how I thought of the genre and how I interacted with it. And I think as the more you immerse yourself in the genre, the more you understand what it has to offer and how broad it is.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a similar relationship to horror as Sadie Hartman, because I know that, of course, she can devour as many horror books as possible, but with films, it can be a slightly different story. And it's interesting how different people react in different ways, because in a sense, like some horror books can be far scarier for me than the movie because I'm filling in the blanks with my imagination, whereas on the screen, it just is whatever is presented to you.
Yeah, I think it depends on the visual. Like, for me, what scares me in a horror book is the slow build of dread. That is the Militia House by John Milas, This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. Um, I'm currently reading Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay, which is coming out in June, I believe. Like it, the uncomfortable dread feeling it leads me with freaks me out. The visuals can be scary, but and I am able to conjure terrifying imagery in my head, but in a movie, if it's like a slow burn and there's like I'm just waiting for the jump scare and I'm more annoyed by that than I am scared by it. But the visual, like a visual that I cannot control, that I am not conjuring, that's being projected to me, that's more terrifying in a horror movie. So I don't like, and I don't even know if it's that I couldn't come up with anything as scary in my own brain versus it's like my own monster. And I feel like Dr. Frankenstein, like I'm in control of the image. So it's less scary because I'm in control. I think it's more of a control thing. And in when there's that like slow burn of dread in a book, I'm not in control. Uh,
Mm,
I
mm.
don't like that. I don't like that at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to get a jump scare in a book. There's very few books that can accomplish that. Um, and I know because the times that I've experienced it, I can count on two hands and have fingers left over, but it was a very visceral experience. Um, in a movie, I'm like you. I don't like the you start hearing the notes on the piano or whatever, and you're
Yes.
like, oh, they're about to do a jump scare, and it's probably going to piss me off because it's not going to be scary. I don't
Yes,
like those. That's
I agree.
annoying. Yeah. Now you pull you pull a Mike Flanagan in like episode, I think it's episode 7 or episode 6 of Haunting a Hill House when they're in the Jeep, and you pulled that kind of jump scare. Shit, I'm scared. That scared the piss out of me. I
Did
mean, what the hell?
Have
That
you
was.
seen um his new one, The House of Usher?
I am like 3 episodes in. I'm taking my time with it because when
The
it's
first
over, it's over.
episode, there's a jump scare in the limo. And he opens
Mm-hmm.
the limo door, and it's a scary visual and it's a jump scare. That,
Yeah.
but I'd rather the jump scare be a legitimate jump scare versus the
Mm-hmm.
like, like we're leading up to a jump scare. We're gonna jump scare you. I don't like that.
Yeah.
Just
You,
do
you
it.
can tell the music changes. You almost have that,
Yes. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's like, come on. How cheap can we get it? It's like, do you
Yeah.
buy that? It's like when you're making a movie. Hey, yeah, we need the jump scare music.
Yeah.
Bring in the yeah. Get the guy
Generic
in for
jump
the jump
scare.
scare. Yeah, we got to do it here. It's in the script. Yeah, I mean, it's like it's prepackaged.
Yeah.
No, surprise me and make it memorable. And that's. But it's really hard to pull it off in a book. Really.
Oh yeah. And I think in terms of films and TV, and it's only really just occurred to me as we're having this conversation, but Mike Flanagan is kind of the master of what I want to term the quiet jump scare. He, particularly in The Haunting of Hill House, there will be ghosts that are just in shot, but you only notice if you really pay attention. So yeah, he doesn't really do much of the build up, it's just there.
Yes. And I think especially in Hill House, where there's like the ghosts and the like, you could be watching it and then all of a sudden, like out of the corner of your eye, see it. Um, but I like it doesn't feel like it's trying too hard, I guess. I don't know, maybe like I've been in the genre too long and now I'm pretentious where I'm
Mm.
like, don't try too hard to impress me, just do it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the quiet jump scare. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, going back to your childhood, I mean, you told us you were telling stories, you were in theater, then at university, you were screenwriting. So I'm wondering, when you were growing up, what was it that you wanted to do, or what was it that you wanted to be?
I wanted to be, when I was younger, I wanted to be an actress because going back to that, like, sort of escapism, I thought, like, how can I be anyone but me? How can I, go travel? And I think I was just looking for any excuse to be someone else and be somewhere else when I was growing up. Um, and I think a lot of the times that I was writing, that was what I was trying to do. But when I was younger, I was like, what's a job where I could be someone else? I was like, oh, I'll be an actress. So when I was younger, I aspired to that. And because of how much I loved film, that's kind of how I got into screenwriting and subsequently novel writing when when I soured on Hollywood.
Right. Well, I understand too that you used to work in TV. So, I mean, I want to know a little bit about your journey in becoming a novel writer. And I want to know what happened before with the screenwriting and the TV work, because this is an area that I have not heard you speak about.
Yeah, so I graduated college in 2010, in December of 2010. Um, and the US was still in a bit of a recession at that time. And my last semester of college, I went to college at Emerson in Boston. And my last semester, they had a program in LA. So I was living in LA at a place called the Oakwoods, which is infamous for housing child stars. So it was like a bunch of college kids and like stage moms like smoking cigarettes by the pool with like the little child actors running everywhere. It's very interesting. And I interned at Focus Features. And at that time, what I really wanted to do was become a development executive. So readings, and that was my internship. I was in development. I was reading scripts. I was passing them along to um, my supervisors, being like, I like this. So that's what I was doing. And that's kind of the path I saw for myself. But I was 21 and I was a fraidy cat and I couldn't crack it. And I'm not a very good driver. And in Los Angeles, you have to drive. And so I was too intimidated to stay in LA. So I moved to New York City. And because the economy wasn't great at that time, and because generally there's just not as many film and TV jobs in New York, I got the first job that I could find, which was working as a production assistant on the Newlywed Game, which is a game show, a very like cheesy game show that I believe has been around since the 70s. And I was working 14-hour days on set, like ordering food, like making sure the whole like crew was fed, um, collecting receipts, doing like I was assisting the line producer. So it was not glamorous work and it was very consuming work. And so I didn't have a lot of time to write. And from there, I worked on another game show pilot and was just sort of miserable and 22 years old in New York City, barely making any money. And I got a job at a TV lighting company, and I was basically the receptionist there. So like all of this, like being like I worked in TV sounds cool, but it like was pretty much not cool. And just a lot of like uh, running around and or sitting around and being angsty, being like, what happened to my life? I had a very specific vision for what was going to happen. But when I worked at the lighting design company, I started to write prose. I'd sort of at that time given up on writing screenplays and feeling a little like I fudged up my Hollywood aspirations. I started writing prose, and then throughout my 20s, after working at the lighting design company, I got a job working in publishing contracts, first for a textbook company and then for Penguin Random House. And then I got a job as an executive assistant at a big corporate bank. And throughout all that time, I was working on my craft. I was writing short stories. I sort of fell back in love with genre, and I was writing weird speculative fiction stories. And when I got to my late 20s, that's when I wrote The Return. So it was a very it was a very weird time and a funky time, and part of me doesn't like talking about it because I don't know if it's particularly interesting, but part of me thinks it's important to talk about because if there's anybody else who's aspiring to write who feels like maybe they're stuck or like wonders if they're on the right path, like I think just forging ahead, because like when I was sitting at the reception desk of that lighting design company, I was sort of like, I've done it. I've given up. Like I've ruined my chance of ever like making my dreams come true. And just was filled with despair, but kept writing and worked out in the end. So
Yeah, there's so much to say about all of that, and something that I'm sure I've mentioned before, but I feel that, all the way up to graduating university and when we're in our early 20s, there's this urgency that we have to find the path, or we have to find the career, we have to be in the job that we want to be in. And if we're not on that path by 21 or 22, it's like, oh, well, you've ruined your life. But then when you get to your 30s, you realize, hang on, this isn't true at all. We've got so much more time. And why are we being fed this lie, to do with careers, to do with relationships? There's this urgency. And I think like a lot of people are probably happier in their 30s, and I assume 40s too, because they kind of see the system and the world for what it is, and they realize that there isn't a prescribed path either. I mean, if you want to be a writer, write. That is effectively the path. And so many people, I mean, they get their start doing it in between jobs, in between like part-time jobs or on their lunch break. And yeah, it's not as glamorous as perhaps we thought it was growing up, but it is the reality. So, I mean, people shouldn't give up. And if we look at when a lot of writers wrote their first book, I mean, so many people, it was in their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. So we have more time than we think we do.
Yeah, and when you're young, everything feels permanent. Like when I was in these unhappy jobs, I felt like I'm going to be here forever. Like I'm never going to get out of this. Like it's hard to fathom that it's just a blip in like a long in a long series of events because you don't have as much context. The older you get, the more you're like, "Oh, I was only at that job that I didn't like for 2 years." When you're 22, 2 years is forever. When you're 34, 2 years is like, "Oh, it's 2 years." Like had I had faith that it was temporary, I think I would have been happier at the time because everything is temporary. But that's a hard thing to wrap your head around when you're in your early 20s and life doesn't look the way you thought it was going to look or is quote unquote supposed to look.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to go back to you having a job working on the Newlyweds game show because there is a delicious irony and something darkly comic. You're probably thinking, well, not for my life. Thank you very much for finding amusement in it. But weddings and this kind of sharp social satire to do with weddings is something that I see throughout your work. So the fact that you were working on a newly wed show, that yeah, there's something ironic, there's something perfect, but it probably wasn't very amusing to you at the time. But hopefully you can glean some humor now
Yes.
looking back and the trajectory that your stories have taken.
Now I love it. Now it's fun to reflect on that. Especially have like thinking about my body of work and if anyone has read my work. I do think it's funny.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to talk about weddings and wedding culture because it is such a part of your work. But I thought something that would be interesting to begin with. I want to know about your wedding because there's so much that you don't like about weddings. What did your wedding look like?
um to to preface this, like I'm very okay with anybody who wants to do, if people are into weddings, like good on them. um I like whatever makes people happy, do it. um my wedding, I got married on a Tuesday morning at the courthouse in Brooklyn, and then we got pancakes, and then we went bowling, and that was it. I didn't have a big. I don't like to be. I like praise. I don't like attention. I don't want to be the center of attention. So, like, and I don't like planning. I don't. I kind of, yeah. The weddings are just not for me. So I like to be a guest sometimes if it's like a low stakes situation, but I think I was in a few weddings in my 20s that were so in as a bridesmaid that were so stressful, and there was so much drama around the wedding that they kind of spoiled weddings for me. Please pray that those friends are not listening to this. But um yeah, I think I'm a little jaded because of personal experiences being in other people's weddings versus more than anything else. And I also do think wedding culture is a bit out of control. But
Yeah, yeah. And when you decided to go for the low key pancakes and bowling wedding, did you have any kind of, I suppose, negative reaction to that? Did you have any like members of family that were upset because they wanted a big wedding? What are you doing? Or was it all quite amicable?
I think my mother and my mother-in-law might have been a little disappointed that they weren't there. But nobody, I think, was like completely disappointed. I mean, my husband has family across continents, and so that would have been complicated if we did have a wedding. They might not have been able to make it. And then my mom is one of 7 and my dad is one of 8. So like there was no way to have like a small something like, and I like, to me it just would have been awkward. Like my parents are now divorced. Like it was just, I think everyone was just like, we're fine with this. Like let us not be bothered. So I didn't have a lot of pushback. Um so personally, like I couldn't have imagined a better day to do. And to me, like if you're committed to somebody, you're committed to somebody. I didn't really care so much about like having being married. Um like to me, like again, my parents are divorced. I'm not like marriage is romantic. It's forever. Like to me, the commitment is more important. So I was fine with the pancakes and bowling.
It sounds like a perfectly reasonable day and a fun, low stress time.
Yes, low stress is ideal.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sensing a theme there.
Yes.
But I mean, as somebody, I suppose, who isn't, how to put this? I mean, your opinion, I suppose, from what you said, has to do with marriage as an institute is not that high. So I wonder what was the impetus that you and your husband thought, you know what? Despite us seeing that there's a lot of facade in terms of weddings and marriages, we're going to do this anyway. I wonder what was the impetus there.
um I mean, I think there is some like romantic, like we'd been together for a while and it seemed like like it seemed important in the sense of like, you know, to, I mean, there is some romance in it, but so I want to say that, but I also think, like, also taxes and health insurance and the logistics of it were also important. So a little bit of both. And because everybody, like, it's annoying if people are like, you've been together when you get like we're like we're together, like fine, like we're married, like leave us alone. Like I think the like, oh, are you gonna get engaged? Like that always bugs me.
Yeah, well, you shut them up pretty quickly because you're like, right, pancakes, bowling, done. You
Yes.
can't ask me anymore.
Yeah.
It's done. Well, as we're talking about weddings, I want to jump into Goblin. Now, I was
Oh,
like, do I go with Black Sheep or do I go with Goblin? But I want to go for Goblin right now. And so, I mean, perhaps a bit of misdirection for the listeners that haven't read it because it's not really about weddings. The protagonist Meg is preparing to go to a wedding, and it's really about eating disorders and dieting. Now, I believe you wrote this in 2016. So, based on what you said, I imagine this must have been one of your earlier stories.
yes. It. I wrote Goblin before I wrote The Return.
Mm. And you've said that this is one of your most personal stories. So I thought we could start there. And I wonder, I mean, what challenges did you face writing a story that was so deeply personal to you?
I think at the time that I wrote it, I assumed no one would write, like no one will read it. And then panic later is kind of my how I feel. Because this was before, like, I wasn't getting anything published. I didn't have a novel to go on submission with. I'd never written a novel. But I struggled with disordered eating pretty much. One of my earliest memories was being 6 years old and dealing with negative self-talk and specifically related to body image. Um, so, but I'd never written about it before. And one of the things that I love about writing horror is it allows me to, I talked earlier about escapism and like not confronting issues. When I write horror, it's the perfect marriage of both. I can confront issues in my life, but I can do it in a way that also feels like escapism, that feels fun and where I feel in control. So Goblin is a perfect example of that because I'm dealing with something I've personally experienced and is a part of my life that I don't know if I will ever get past. But I'm also having a lot of fun writing something like messed up and gnarly. And it has it was the ending of that story so satisfying to write, and it really surprised me. I didn't see it coming until it happened, and I was disgusted with myself and also completely satisfied. So I it was I didn't like sit down and think like, oh yeah, I'm gonna like get into this deeply personal thing. I didn't think about like it's going to be a personal story. It just sort of happened, and there was some catharsis in it, and I'm proud of that story. And it's probably the thing that I've written that I think about the most.
Yeah, and in terms of that ending, I mean, Bob, when he's talking about writing advice, he'll often say that for a story to be successful, it has to be logical but unpredictable. And
Mm.
that was absolutely logical and unpredictable. And, now that I've read it, I mean, while reading it, yeah, I didn't know where is this going to ultimately go. But as soon as you finish it, it's like, well, it had to.
Yes.
It had to end like that. And yeah, I really do urge people who haven't to absolutely read it. So I believe that it is in the Bad Dolls short story collection, but it is also available online. Is it a website called something like Electric Literature?
Yes. Yes. Electric literature. It's
Okay, so
linked
it
on my
is
website too.
exactly Electric Literature
Yeah.
then.
It is.
Yeah.
It's something. It's exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, such a remarkable story. Goodness, now we've got this spoiler talk dichotomy because I
Yes.
do want to talk about it, but then it's like, or should I just leave it for people to to experience?
Well, we can give a spoiler warning, and if people haven't, they can flash
Yeah, so
fast
mild
forward.
spoiler warning. We'll start with some low level spoilers, and it
Yes.
might deteriorate from there. But you can go to the show notes on thisishorror.co.uk to see when we stop talking about Goblin. But I mean, something as well as eating disorders. I mean, it seamlessly fuses that together with kind of our reliance on technology, our addiction to applications. And so the goblin, the titular goblin, is referring to an app that gives you a literal goblin that is going to help you lose weight. So did you kind of know a lot of the elements of this story going into it?
It's been a while, but I do think I had the idea of a dieting app where there's a creature who literally bats food out of your hand, like who is physically there to deprive you of things. Because I don't remember when certain apps came out, but there's like, I have a Fitbit, like there's Noom, there's like now Weight Watchers has an app, and I grew up in the 90s, and like I think any woman who grew up in the 90s has some issue with food, because there was the heroin chic, and even just going back and watching episodes of Friends. If you grew up watching Friends, all those women are bone thin, and all of these, and then there was like yogurt commercial, there's a lot of literature about this online, but it was kind of ingrained in me. And then I get to a certain age, I get to my mid-20s, and I start to realize that maybe this is wrong. It had never occurred to me that they were wrong, that the magazines were wrong, that it was always something is wrong with me because I cannot be that, or that I'm not there yet. I am not good enough yet. And so I had this, like, it's, foreshadowing, but it's like cult deprogramming, where you start to realize, wait a minute, what, like, they're telling me I need to eat this yogurt to be thin, but they're not, like, it's not about that. It's about me buying this fucking yogurt. And so I think I hit these epiphanies in my mid-20s, but also felt unable to break out of, there's the more disordered eating stuff underneath that, but to sort of on top of that, kind of peeling back the societal pressure and seeing through that, and like, you aren't trying to help me be better. You are trying to suck me dry and take my money by constantly telling me I'm not good enough and you can help me. And so thinking about and seeing that transition from commercials and TV shows to apps on my phone, that kind of transition, like, okay, that's sort of where Goblin was born out of, reaching these, in my mid-20s, kind of reaching this point and seeing the shift in my own perception, and then also in diet culture, from where it used to be, which was more on my TV and magazines, to like, oh, it followed me here. Like, they figured out a way to reach me someplace else. And kind of this idea, like having this epiphany that I'm never going to be free of it. Like, I have to free myself. And so that's, I remember feeling those kind of frustrations, and having conversations with my friends at the same time, being like, why are we doing this to ourselves, to our bodies? And there's a salad place chain that popped up in New York City around this time called Sweet Green. And I kind of vaguely reference it in the story, but people would line around the block to get a salad, and it was like $17. And like, having the sense, like waiting in the line and just being like, this is ludicrous. Like having those kind of realizations that I had never had before in my life. So, yeah, $17 wait. I should never wait in line for salad. I'm sorry. Just
$17, it better come with a pizza.
right?
You know, it's like, damn.
Yeah. I've been there before because I have a gluten allergy, so it means that my what I can eat is limited. So I have had to queue for a bloody overpriced salad before because it's the only kind of option that's available. And yeah, yeah. I mean, at that point, it's like I could just do a bit of impromptu intermittent fasting. Like, let's just not eat. Let's wait till we get home and have a goddamn steak and potatoes. Let's do something proper. But
I mean, to be fair, from what I remember, they were good salads, but like no
yeah,
salad is that good. But I
yeah,
think it was more about like, it's one thing if you actually want the salad, and it's another thing if you're like, I need to be eating the salad. It's a different like
Mm-hmm.
mentality. And I don't know if it was culturally a shift or just the age I was when I wrote the story, where it felt like I I was coming out of this and being like, like I said, in like a cult where it's like they promised me the apocalypse 8 times. Maybe it's not actually coming. Like that's kind of how it felt, and that's where the story came from. And then just having the visual, like I was probably eating something I felt like I quote unquote shouldn't have been eating, and being like, what if a little creature came and was just like, no, just smacked me. So
yeah, yeah. Because I mean, yeah, you were metaphorically being hit by every 90s sitcom and
yeah,
movie and commercial anyway. Might as well manifest that into
yeah,
reality.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've been rewatching a lot of 90s movies recently, and everything you're saying is so on point, and there seems to be in the vast majority of films even some kind of subplot about a woman wanting to lose some weight. And the thing that I suppose is even more shocking, watching it in 2023, is the amount of times you'll see just some bloke who, I mean, it's kind of beside the point, but he ain't that great looking. He ain't in shape at all. And he'll say to a woman who, by no definition, is even a bit overweight, he'll start poking fun at her weight. And I mean, I think what was it wasn't even about wanting the woman to lose weight, but it was that people realized this is something that women are sensitive about, and they're just going to be an asshole. Like they.
and to look back on that, and to have grown up in an environment where that was so like unapologetically in our faces, it was impossible not to internalize that. And to get to the point, like even recently I put on super bad in a hotel room at night because it was on, and watching it back, and this isn't about weight, but just watching super bad and being like, this aged terribly. Like this is so like, this isn't even like, this isn't funny. It's just like kind of sickening and sad. And to have these like epiphanies later when you watch stuff back, I think is very eye opening. And it's sometimes it's enraging, but sometimes it's also very freeing to be like, I cared so much about these things, or like I thought I had to be this way because this is what society was saying and how they thought I should be, and then kind of letting go of that and rebelling against it. Um, like diet culture, like wedding culture, like having to deal with somebody making raunchy jokes, like a raunchy super bad-esque joke, and then if you as a woman don't like it, then oh, you're not cool, you're not like with it. Like, so it's interesting to look back on this stuff, and then to have, I sometimes I look back on the things I write and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm angry. Like, why am I so pissed off? Like, I read back, like, I don't think I'm an angry person. And then I'll read stuff that I write and I'm like, where is this anger coming from? And then I'll like watch Superbad and be like, it's here. It's because I watched this movie, like sitting next to a bunch of my dude friends, and they were all laughing. And I felt like I had to laugh too. And if I didn't laugh, there was something wrong with me. And like, not the fact that like, this is like teenage boys like objectifying their female classmates to the point of like, just like beyond anything. And yeah, maybe that's where my rage comes from. Maybe that's why Goblin ends the way it ends, because like I had to watch those fucking yogurt commercials when I was 8 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, of course, I mentioned in movies like blokes making fun of women, but of course, like there was also a lot of women poking fun at other women.
Oh
And
yeah.
like, I remember with my own mother, and I don't think if she watches this, she should take too much offense because, Mum, I love you, but you know it's true. But she had a lot of issues with her own weight. But then, like, apropos of nothing, someone would come on to the television and she'd be like, well, she's put on a bit of weight. It's like,
Yeah.
what? Nobody, not me, not my dad. Nobody said or comment on this, but it would happen. They'd be like sniping at other women and like and weird comments that really just reflected, her own insecurities. Being like, oh, I've noticed this, and like what one thing that I have observed, a lot of women seem to be obsessed or fixated with cellulite, but I have never met a man that says, like, you know what I don't like on a woman? Cellulite. It just
That's
it doesn't happen. We don't care. We don't think about that kind of thing.
I once met um there was a woman who taught pole dancing close to Emerson College, and my friend and I went on Valentine's Day to take a class with her, and she was a brilliant woman. She studied like she wrote a book about dead popes, like brilliant, like she was like very like I think she had a PhD, but like very cool and also like a very talented pole dancer. And she looked at my friend and I and she was like, people are stupid. If you're confident in yourself, no one's going to care. If you look at somebody and you're like, this is my cellulite, this is the hottest thing you've ever seen in your life, they're going to be like, oh yeah. Like it's about confidence. And I think a lot of what happens in society is trying to break down women's confidence for money and it ripples throughout society and the culture, because if a woman feels like she needs to hide her cellulite, she's going to buy the cellulite cream that you're selling. And then it's like, okay, then they're making money off this insecurity, but there's nothing wrong with you. Like, you're probably very hot. And I think something that I always struggled with was I always found other like women beautiful. Like I never ever looked at anybody else's body and thought like anything but positive things about them. It was always specific to me. And I think that was another I think they made attempts, like there's definitely like you were saying about your mother making comments, like I think that might have been a generation above me, because my mother would make comments like that too. Because I think there was pressure on them too, but they took the pressure and sort of externalized it. And I think for me, as I'm a millennial, for me and all my friends, we always internalized it. It was always like, we would always make self deprecating comments about ourselves, but never about our other friends. So it's interesting how generationally it is like different. And I'm very grateful to see, I feel like it's now moving in a different direction and there's more body positivity. But, it's definitely like, we could talk about it for a long time and unpack it for a long time, because there's a lot there. And I think it's kind of a reckoning that we all have personally. And I think it's a reckoning that kind of comes in waves. Like, you'll see articles about it and come out around the same time. But it's worth reflecting on. And I think that's why Goblin was so cathartic and why I still think about it so much, because even though it felt good to write it, like, I'm never going to completely exorcise that demon, because it was just baked into me since I was a kid.
Yeah, and it seems like, obviously, from talking to you now, that you've seen what has happened. You realize where the eating disorder came from. You can see too that it was a lot of manufactured bullshit from companies trying to sell products. But as you say, it is in a sense still baked into you. So, I mean, what do you do when you have that kind of head goblin, which is a wonderful metaphor, kind of telling you these things and trying to encourage eating disorders, for want of better phrasing?
I think it's hard because some days you can dismiss, for any sort of negative self talk, some days you can dismiss it, and other days you stew in it. And so I don't really have a solution other than to know. When I was younger, I thought I could beat it. Like, if I were to be, like, if I were to starve myself, if I were to be smaller, if I were to look different, if I were to look better, then I wouldn't feel that way. And that's something that I confronted in Goblin as well, where Meg is has this realization that she has this vision of herself on her wedding day making herself throw up. And she realizes that she's never going to hit a point where she feels good enough. And that was an epiphany that I had too, where I'm never going to feel 100, like, I'm never going to feel good enough. I'm always going to have these moments where I feel like I should not do this thing because it is bad, because it will make me feel uncomfortable in my body. It will make me, it's wrong. It's wrong for me to do this. It's better for me to deprive myself. That deprivation is good. I will be accepted if I, like, eat the fucking salad. And I think learning that even if I don't feel good about myself on a day, knowing that it's not like, well, if I did X, Y, and Z, then I would feel good. I kind of know that, like, I'm never going to reach a point where I'm completely free of the goblin. I'm always going to live with the goblin, but to not let the goblin run my life is sort of where I've landed.
And how does this manifest into other areas of your life? Because, I mean, as writers, we often have self doubt on some level. So I'm wondering, what do you do in those moments where you have self doubt or self deprecation in some way? Are there things that you've got in place to help with your mental health and to help put things in perspective?
I rely on people who I'm close to, who love me. When it comes to writing, there are a certain compliments that I've received from writers I respect that I keep in my back pocket. Well, this person said this to me. And so, like, that makes me feel really good. I also have, when I was in high school, I knew this girl who I walked into her bedroom for the first time. We were hanging out, and she had a wall of photos of herself. And she was like, I'm not conceited. I'm just very insecure. And these are all pictures that I think I look good in. And I like that stuck in my head for a really long time. And so if somebody tags me in a really nice review or sends me a message like, I really connected to this book, I screenshot it and I put it in a folder in a little album called Confidence Boost. So if I get tagged in a nasty review, or if I'm having a day where I feel like bad about myself in terms of writing or my career, I can look back and be like, no, what I do matters and has value. So a little bit of that. And then I was having a tough time this year. And so I went on Lexapro. Like, I think there's nothing wrong with like when you have, if you're struggling with your mental health, getting help where you need it. So in many ways, like this was like a really good career year, but like I think also as you get older, you realize that, you know, just because when I was, 25 at the lighting company sitting in front of that desk, I was like, if only, like I was always a happy when person. Like I'll be happy when I get a book published, or I'll be happy when I get 2 books published. And then kind of realizing that like success doesn't necessarily equate to happiness, and like having a happy home life doesn't necessarily like is not going to solve your mental health issues, or your anxiety and things like that. So yeah, a mix of the confidence boost folder, having a good supportive group of friends, and some medication, a low dosage of medication to just help me through.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I mentioned before eating a gluten-free diet, and so that came off the back of me being in considerable pain because of arthritis and then experimenting with diet, and it got me off 10 prescription pharmaceutical tablets a day and injecting myself once a week. And then for a while after that, I became quite reluctant to take any pharmaceuticals. I think because I was terrified of having some sort of dependency or going back to that situation that I was in before. But, you know, luckily, I realized, like, look, sometimes you don't have to make life hard for yourself. You can just take a pharmaceutical. Don't rely on it every single time, perhaps, but there are certain times where it's just easier. And it's like, we're living in the modern world. There is modern medication. So, yeah, sometimes you just got to take that pill.
Yeah, if you need help, I think there's nothing wrong with getting it. And so, um, yeah, earlier this year, I was like, yep, I think I need help, and I got some help, and I'm doing much better. So, big advocate for doing whatever works for you and not suffering in silence.